Hey guys, it's Laura from Lightning Cosplay. In the past 3 months we've worked on our most challenging cosplay project ever. To celebrate the 10th anniversary of Warframe, Digital Extremes reached out to us for a collaboration. Warframe is an award-winning co-op looter shooter and is available for free on all platforms, so definitely check this out. You find the link in the video description. They asked us to create one of their most iconic characters, the Lotus. She's known as Mother to the Tenno, and I just love the character design so much. And we not only created the costume, we also traveled all the way from Germany to Canada to visit TennoCon 2023, and it was an amazing experience. So, if you are curious how we brought the Space Mom to life, lean back and enjoy. The Lotus has a super unique and special character design which I love so much. Digital Extremes provided us the best reference material and also the 3D model. But of course, this 3D model didn't fit my body measurements at all. So it's Ralph's job to separate all parts from the 3D file, adjust them and change some things that might not work as a costume part. Mostly people underestimate how much work goes into all the 3D work. It takes a lot of experience to make a 3D model work for cosplay and also consider everything for the printing process. I always like to start working on the costume part I'm most afraid of, and in this case it was Lotus legs. The plan was to make them out of silicone, and so far I only made silicone muscle suits, so making legs was completely new for me. First came the most annoying part, sanding the 3D prints. All the sanding, filling, priming to get rid of the seam lines takes days. When I was happy with the surface, I gave the legs a deep clean and started to prepare them for molding. First, I stabilized them with these pieces of wood and made a cardboard base for the clay. I'm making a 2-part mold, and with the clay you separate the 2 halves of the mold. I'm using normal water-based sculpting clay. Time for silicone. The molds are going to be quite huge and silicone is super expensive, so I'm making a brush-on mold. This way you only need 3 to 4 thick coats of silicone and make a shell to keep the mold in shape. These silicone stripes work as keys to make sure the shell and the silicone mold fit perfectly together. For the shell I mix up a very thick epoxy resin called Epoxacoat. This is the clean base coat. On top I added a lightweight epoxy putty in the corners of the registration keys and several coats of a clear epoxy resin and fiberglass cloth to get a strong shell. When the epoxy shell was completely cured, I turned the whole thing and removed the wood pieces, the clay and the cardboard, and cleaned everything with water. Then again I applied several coats of silicone and made the epoxy shell. For the second half of the mold, it's basically the exact same process like before. Before we opened the mold, we drilled holes where we can later add screws when putting the mold back together for the casting process. Opening the mold after this whole process is always so nerve-wracking, and you hope for the best. You never know if something went wrong with the silicone, like air bubbles or cure inhibition. But this time everything turned out perfect. Always makes me so happy and proud. Here we have the giant molds for both legs. To get the perfect purple for Lotus, I mixed the silicone colors blue, purple, white and black in different ratios. We had many reference pictures with different lighting. The purple always looks a bit different, but I think I figured out a good shade that will look good in a bright and a dark environment. As silicone, I used my all-time favorite dragon skin. I took a big amount of part A and mixed the purple color. I mixed up that much because I wanted to make sure that I have enough purple for the whole project. Well, obviously this wasn't enough for all parts, but at least for the legs and the shoes. Before I could start with the casting process, I had to prepare the mold, which means getting rid of dust, dirt and cat hair. And when you're going to cast silicone into a silicone mold, you need a lot of release spray. Then it became serious. I poured in the silicone and used a brush to spread it. This is a very time-consuming process because the silicone cures very fast and you can only work in small batches. When I was sure the silicone was thick enough, I added some thickened silicone to the edge and put the mold together. This way both halves will bond. After everything was fully cured, I opened the mold. Again, a very nerve-wracking moment for me. We had a tough time schedule and there was no time for mistakes or redoing anything. But most of the time I know what I'm doing and everything went as planned. I was so relieved when I saw how good the legs came out. They just needed a little trim on the seam line and they were ready for paint. Okay, before painting I had to give them a deep clean to remove all the release spray leftovers and the cat hair, which I always struggle with in my workshop. Nothing sticks to silicone except of silicone, so you have to paint it with silicone. First I sprayed on a clear coat of thinned down silicone glue. There are different silicone paints on the market, but I like to use the Psycho Paint system. So I mixed up my colors and gave the legs a light shading. Both legs were then glued onto a pants with silicone glue. This was also a very tricky process, but I somehow made it work. Last step was to add the gold details on the knees and the pants were done. Nearly done, because we also needed the matching shoes. First, Ralph prepared the 3D file and we did several test prints. After each print we had to do some adjustments on the 3D model. Print it again, check the fit, do more adjustments, print again, until it fits perfectly. Doing all the test prints and working on the model until it fits is one of the reasons why 3D printing a cosplay can take a lot of time. When we finally got the perfect fit, we sanded and primed the prints so they were ready for molding. I again made a brush-on silicone mold. This time it was quite easy because it only needed to be a one-part mold. But for an easier demolding process, I made a 2-part epoxy shell. When I make an epoxy shell with multiple parts, like you see here, I like to use aluminum foil and aluminum tape to make the separation. You could of course also use clay, but this is the quick and dirty version and it works just fine. The shell turned out okay, could be better, but the silicone mold turned out pretty nice. The shoes are a bit tricky to cast because they are also black and purple. So I first brushed in the purple parts and made sure the silicone was thick enough so it doesn't run to the half of the shoe that was supposed to be black. Then I did the black half. After a few coats, the silicone was thick enough and ready for demolding. The shoes also turned out very nice, they only needed a little trim on the edges. So let's put everything together. I cut open the toe part with a small and sharp scissor and sewed in a toe separator. The silicone cover was then glued onto the shoe with silicone glue. Before I could go on with painting, the shoes needed to be cleaned with soap to get rid of the dust and also the release agent. They also got primed with a clear coat of silicone glue, and then I added a few shades with the same silicone paint I used for the legs. And then the legs were finally done. Since my own legs don't have these big muscles, I also added foam padding inside the calves and the upper legs, so the silicone keeps the shape. Next up we made the neck. To make it as comfortable as possible, we also wanted to make the neck out of silicone. After a few test prints to check the fit, we printed the final piece and spent some time with sanding, filling and priming to prepare it for molding. For the neck, I also had to make a 2-part silicone mold. So I separated the halves with clay. This time I used an oil-based clay, which I like more than the water-based clay, to be honest. It doesn't make such a mess when you remove it from the print to make the second half of the silicone mold. The silicone I used here is basically the same I used for the legs. It's also a brushed-on silicone, it's just a bit harder. As you can see, it's again the same process like for the legs. And the mold turned out so pretty. This time I only had to make everything purple, so this was much easier, but I had to be careful with the thickness of the whole piece. If I would make it too thick, especially on the edges, it would not look good. And also you don't want the piece to be too thin. Well, that said, I needed 3 attempts until I was happy with the cast. After adding a few shades with silicone paint, the base of the neck piece was done. So, on to the next part, which was the golden middle part. It's nearly impossible to get a nice metallic finish on silicone pieces, which means we needed another material for that. So the middle part was also molded, but I wanted to try to cast it with a semi-rigid resin to keep the flexibility of the whole neck piece. I added gold pigments to the mold and poured in the black flexible resin. Here you can already see how flexible the resin is. It's amazing. I added the golden part with brass fastener. They are a great alternative to gluing. I also sewed on Velcro to the fabric pieces, which I glued onto the silicone neck, so the neck can be closed on the back. But there was still a little detail missing. I also molded and casted the little back piece of the neck with the same flexible resin I used for the front part, and added it with magnets. So it hides the fabric part and is also detachable. I think the neck turned out so nice, and it's not as uncomfortable to wear as I thought it would be. Making the top was a real challenge. We planned it to be a mixture of fabric and silicone. So first Ralph did his 3D magic and our friends from Chizu Cosplay printed and sanded it for us. I prepared the top for molding and decided to make a 3-part mold. I did my best to separate the mold in areas where the color of the top changes from black to purple, so the seams will be nearly invisible on the final silicone piece. I again went through the same time-consuming process of making the brush-on mold, then the epoxy shell, turn the mold, do the next part until I was done with all parts. In total, it took 6 days to make this mold. And I'm super proud how the mold turned out. Did I ever mention that I love mold making? It feels like a combination of being a chemical scientist and handcrafting engineer, if you know what I mean. The casting process was very challenging because I had to figure out which parts needed to be black and which would be purple. After like 8 hours of mixing and brushing countless of coats into the silicone molds, it was finally time to assemble the mold. I applied thickened silicone to the seams to get a strong bond between all parts. And then it was finally time for demolding to see if all the hard work paid off. I'm so happy with how the top came out, and I'm so proud that the seams are nearly invisible. Now I just had to cut off the excess material and the top was ready for painting. As I already mentioned before, I wanted to combine silicone and fabric for the top. For the fabric part, our friend Nelly from Zwillingsnadel Cosplay visited us and did her magic. It may sound weird, but it's always difficult for me to let someone else do a part of my cosplay, but when we have a very tight time schedule, I simply can't do everything myself. But I trust Nelly and she always impresses me with her work. So when she was done with the top, I could glue on the silicone piece with this super special silicone glue. I loved to see how all parts were coming together. The back will be closed with a zipper and Velcro. But to hide that, the back piece is still missing, which we did next. Here we have the raw print, which needed to be sanded and filled, and sanding a detailed piece like this takes days. Then it was time to mold it. Luckily, here I could make a simple 1-part mold. You already know the drill. Multiple layers of silicone, registration keys for the shell, and then all the different coats for the epoxy shell. Ta-da! Here we have a beautiful mold. I started by brushing in the black parts. I did multiple coats and then the purple part was super easy. The only thing that is always a bit tricky is to know when you should stop adding more silicone so the piece doesn't get too thick. This is, by the way, also part of the back piece. Finally, demolding time. So satisfying. I trimmed the edges with a sharp X-Acto knife. The back piece also went through the same painting process like the other pieces to give it a bit more depth. I also added these golden details which I 3D printed and painted. Then the top was finally done and look how cool it looks from the front and the back. The back part is, by the way, also attached with magnets. I'm so proud of this piece. The main piece of the Lotus cosplay is definitely the helmet. Ralph again did his magic and fitted the Lotus helmet to the 3D scan of my head. We did a test print to check the overall fit, and here you can already see where we added the small slits for the eyes, so I'm not completely blind when I wear the helmet. The final helmet was then printed with resin. We already have a quite big resin printer, but still had to separate it into 6 pieces. All parts got a first round of sanding and were then glued together. For big areas without details, we sometimes like to use our orbital sander. I spent countless of hours to sand the helmet to get rid of the seams. The helmet got its last coat of filler, and look at this, how pretty it already looked. And then finally came the most fun part, painting. After all this mold making and casting and complicated silicone painting techniques, it felt really good to kind of just old school paint a costume part with acrylic colors. I also made the stencils for the helmet. In this moment, my original job as graphic designer pays off. Knowing how to create a vector graphic in no time is a very useful skill. I cut out the stencils with our vinyl cutter. The helmet has the iconic lotus flower on the front, which I really love, and also some pretty ornaments on the sides. I added a bit of weathering, and Ralph did the electronics. The helmet also has these super cool tendrils on the back. For that I used foam dowels. They have a good flexibility and are also not too heavy. Like on the reference pictures, I added half-round foam dowels to the 2 thick tendrils. To seal the foam and to get an even smoother finish, I painted them with black flexi paint. Afterwards, I gave them an off-white base color and then painted them blue. Last but not least, some additional weathering. And then I could add the gold details I 3D printed and painted with a beautiful gold. The finished tendrils were then attached to the back piece of the helmet, and then the main piece of my favorite part of the cosplay was also done. In combination with the neck piece, it looks so cool. Let's do the last part of the costume, the arms. Ralph first fitted the shape to my arms, and we did a few test prints before we sent the files to our friends from Chizu Cosplay, who again printed and sanded the pieces for us. When I got the finished prints, I could start with the molding process. This is again gonna be a 2-part mold. Here you see how I applied the first coat of silicone and used my air gun to make sure there are no bubbles. I think you've already seen so much mold making process at this point, so let me speed this up for you. When I made the arms, I knew it was the last big mold I had to make, and it made me so happy to see they turned out so good. I think I've never made so many molds, especially not so many big molds for only one costume. The casting process was extra tricky this time because there was a third color. The shoulder part of the arms has the same blue like the helmet and the tendrils. I really like the color combination of the whole outfit, by the way. The demolding process also went super smooth, and after trimming the seam I could already start with the painting. On the shoulder area we have the same ornaments Lotus has on the helmet, so I painted them on by hand. The hands are of course also part of the arm, so we 3D printed the hands with our resin printer. After sanding and filling, I made the molds. These were the very last molds for this project, and they were super fun to make. Again, this is a 2-part mold, and I realized that this was the first time I molded gloves. Again, I had to work with 2 colors, so I started with the black parts and then did the purple ones. Look how cool they turned out. Now they just needed a bit of shading and the very last silicone parts of this costume project were done. I sewed some gloves out of an elastic, little bit shiny fabric. We also 3D printed the finger pieces with our resin printer, and after sanding and painting them, I glued them onto the gloves with hot glue. For me this works best, but you have to be very careful not to burn your skin, especially when the fabric is very thin. And the arms were not done yet. I wanted the shoulder piece to have a slight metallic finish, so the best option was to 3D print it and then add it to the silicone arm. I am so happy how good my plan worked out. For the tubes on the arms and the hands, I used the same foam dowels I also used for the headpiece. Here you see how I put on the glove. There's a magnet which connects the end of the tube and the glove. And these are the finished arms in all their glory. So proud how they turned out, and I even can bend my arm quite well. This was an intense crafting marathon, but of course we made it just in time for TennoCon, and it was an amazing experience, so make sure to check out our TennoCon recap shorts. We've got so much nice feedback online and at TennoCon. The Warframe community is just so friendly and supportive. We are just so happy that we had the chance to make so many people happy with bringing the Space Mom to life. Thank you so much Digital Extremes for your trust. Warframe is free to play on all platforms. You find the link in the video description. Definitely check it out, I can highly recommend it. And now, let me present you the Lodos.
Dream. Not of what you are, but of what you want to be.